All right. Let's move this out a little bit because it's time to build some worlds. Welcome, everyone, to World Building Wednesday, where today we are going to talk about various aspects of building a world. And we already talked about quite a few things in the show. And today we're going to talk a bit about justice in your world and in your society. How justice works, how crimes are handled in your world. Because it differs a lot from society to society. So the first question, of course, to ask is, what is a crime? What are the severities of crime? How are crimes reported? What punishments are there for crime? Right? So let's start there. Obviously, some things are considered crimes in some societies and others are not. Certain intellectual property concerns are crimes in some countries and others are not. And certainly over history, there have been very different views of certain aspects of what is a crime and what isn't. So it's worth thinking through in terms of your society, and usually the question is that which causes a breakdown in social order. Often property based. Okay? So then this was often very true in, say, medieval times, where crimes were divided into roughly two categories, sort of two and a half. One was basically crimes around personal property. So if you stole something, if you broke something, if you destroyed something owned by somebody else, including killing somebody, which was taking away their life, technically a possession, that was one kind of crime. And then there were crimes against the state and crimes against like public property. So if you destroyed a bridge, that was a crime against the state, and it was sort of bigger. And there's of course crime against royalty and nobility, which was sort of a crime against the state because of the scale of that, of the consequences of that behavior. So in a sense, those sorts of things, trying to kill a king was, in a sense, a murder, but also sort of a crime against the public. So it can get a little complicated, but also just, again, worth thinking about in your society. What's bad? What is something that should be punished, right? And then what are the scales of that? So again, we can think about minor, simple punishments, major, big punishments, massive, we'll say, really big punishments. So typically, fines, imprisonment slash physical, what would you call it? Physical, like branding or tattooing or something along those lines. Physical modification, maybe. Cutting off a finger, cutting off a hand, and then massive, which is generally death. Imprisonment, torture might be a thing for major crimes. So it's kind of hard to get much worse than death for a punishment. Obviously, you can do torture for a long time, but that's generally expensive, so it's pretty rare. Now, it should be pointed out, for example, in medieval Europe, generally speaking, there were two major punishments for crimes. A fine or death, which meant that basically, simple things were common enough and were considered not a big deal enough. Again, letting your cows graze on somebody else's land, that you just get fined, and that would be the end of it. But the idea was you kind of worked up to, and rather quickly, to these big crimes, and you needed a big deterrent. Prisons are expensive. So, again, in medieval times, generally people weren't imprisoned as a punishment. They were imprisoned awaiting trial, or they were imprisoned if you couldn't kill them effectively. So they were imprisoned to sort of keep them away. Royalty, nobility who had been captured in battle might be imprisoned. They may not be imprisoned in an actual prison, but imprisoned like in somebody's house, so under house arrest basically. But there weren't, a significant number of prisons, in the sense of this is where we hold people who have committed a crime as punishment. Because it's expensive. You have to keep them alive. You have to make sure that they're not too cruelly mistreated over the course of years and years. So that really wasn't a big deal. And the idea is it's just quicker to just kill somebody, right? And cheaper and simpler, and it tends to deter crime, ideally. Or at least that's the logic of it. So worth thinking through in your society, and this also gets into scale of society. So if you have a small group of people, if you have a small population, the death penalty has too big of a consequence to the gene pool to make much sense as a punishment for all but the most ridiculous of the most massive of offenses, right? You generally want to keep folks around as much as possible. So that's the thing to think about as well. So some of the punishments you can have, you have fines. You also have public humiliation. And you can have revoking public privileges, for lack of a better term. So, having your driver's license revoked in modern society, having certain social services turned off for you because you have abused society. In effect, you can think of the equivalent of, I'm trying to think of a good example actually. Maybe there's some national registry, for example, and if you do something really bad, you will not be served at restaurants anymore, for the next 6 months, for example. Things along those lines. So you'll be shunned or otherwise have social consequences for your crime. Public humiliation, obviously tarring and feathering, although that was also painful, very physically painful. But other things like that, putting somebody in the stocks, which generally the stocks were something that you be put in for like a day, and then pelted with vegetables or otherwise verbally abused. It was more for as a visible record and ridicule than a torture in any sense, right? You weren't generally beaten while you were in the stocks. You were just placed there so the entire community could see that person did something bad, and thus, even after the punishment is over socially, or even after the punishment is over in terms of the punishment for the crime, your entire community now knows you did a thing. And that was part of the reason for things like stocks and other public punishments, because they informed everyone you're a criminal. And those have dire consequences, especially if you're in a small community. All right, so there's that. So then, how are crimes reported? This is actually an important thing. There were no permanent police forces until relatively recently in society. There was no New York Police Department until the 1800s, basically. So how do crimes get reported? And in medieval times, often they were self-reported. So you would be put in what was called a tithing, which is a group of 10 to 20 people, roughly, in your community, where if anyone in that tithing committed a crime, you were responsible for reporting that. And you were also responsible for making sure that person, went to court and went for their punishment and all that kind of stuff. And you were also responsible for showing up if that person was accused of a crime and telling people about what you knew about that person. So the idea was, it was essentially a mini, everyone was part of a tiny police force made up of a bunch of their peers. And so it was very hard to get away with something by just bribing a police officer, because there would be 10 of them, and you have to sort of bribe everybody and put everyone in on this one job. Compared to today, where it's like, well, it's a little easier to if one police officer shows up or two police officers show up, it's a different situation than if your police are the 15 people in your neighborhood, right? And so, yeah, you might be able to convince a few of them to turn a blind eye, but probably not all of them. And also importantly, under the tithing system, any infractions resulting from the group would cause the entire group to get punished. So if somebody in the tithing committed a crime and somebody else in the tithing knew about it and didn't report it, everyone would be fined. Right? So this created a strong reason for everybody to report on any crimes they saw so that they wouldn't get fined for it, right? So those are the kinds of structures you can think of. So there might be, permanent police, self-reporting groups, medieval tithings, rewards. So it could be as simple as if a crime occurs and you report it, you get a reward, as long as that has been, once that's proven to have actually happened. You don't just get money for reporting. Lots of different ways of doing crime reporting, but it's not necessarily going to be a permanent police department. Now, in most societies, you will have some people responsible for enforcement of crime. So you may not have a police force, but you'll have a sheriff or a bailiff or somebody who, once a crime is committed, or once people know something's up, this person will get called in to kind of deal with it. So you will have some level of crime prevention or crime detection in your society, but it's generally not excuse me, dozens of people patrolling the streets, right? Though those may occur in special circumstances. So you may say that if crime goes up, essentially a militia is formed or like a city watch is formed to deal with surges in crime. And then punishments for crime. We talked about some of these before. Fines, public humiliation, anywhere from temporary. Well, I can't spell humiliation, nor can I say it apparently. Temporary or physically damaging, right? Like tarring and feathering, generally is something that will leave some scars. Body modification, branding, tattooing. Wow, I cannot type tonight. Modification, tattooing, removing limbs, cut off a thief's hands, imprisonment. Again, I know I'm kind of writing up what we saw up there. Imprisonment, torture, and then revoking public services, and of course, death. Note, an important one is only the accused punished. So, for example, in Japanese law, especially feudal Japanese law, if somebody was found guilty of a crime, their family would be punished. There was actually no concept of an individual getting punished for a crime. The entire family unit was considered culpable and part of it, so the entire family would get killed, or branded or what have you as a result of a crime, or taxed or fined. So these are things worth doing. This is a world building video where we're talking about how to consider justice when building a world. For those just tuning in. So, let's see here. These are all possible punishments for committing a crime. Obviously, there are others as well. You can have just bad things being done to somebody. Shave somebody's head, force them to wear a silly thing in public, or not so silly thing in public. The Scarlet Letter, quite famously, is the idea of of wearing a thing to indicate your guilt in a crime, and that advertised it to everyone else. And that's more of a social punishment, right? You're not in physical pain, but everyone else will treat you differently because of that. So it's all all possible. Then you can also think about something I wanted to bring up. Are there any unjust crimes? I bring this up because sometimes you have, and sometimes you want to explore in your story or your world or your game, whatever you're building this world for. You may want to explore some crimes that you feel aren't actual crimes or should not be punished the way they are. So you may have a society that finds certain uses certain substances illegal, and you don't think that is appropriate, and you want to explore that in your story. You may find a society that does not find any use of certain substances a problem, and you may want to explore that. What happens when this is not a crime? What would that do to society? So it's worth thinking through, and this is an important part of any kind of world building exercise. What do you find appropriate crimes and punishments? You have to distance yourself to a certain extent from your world and think about how people in that world would view certain behaviors and what they would consider to be a crime versus what you would consider to be a crime. You may think that everyone should be able to smoke anything they want to, but the people in your world might not. And they may have had circumstances that make sense for them to make that a crime, right? It can also be worth digging into if you start worrying about this and thinking about this and getting kind of wrapped around the axle of whether you think something should or shouldn't be a crime. It helps to go back and look at the history of those things. Wikipedia can be a help here. You're not necessarily looking for every fact, but a question of why are certain things considered a crime in certain societies. So, for example, often certain illegal substances that you might inject into your body are illegal not necessarily for the substance itself, but for what people will go through to get the substance, right? So cocaine is very harmful to a person, but also if a person can't get cocaine, they will tend to commit all sorts of crimes to get what they need. So it's kind of a larger social ill besides just the substance itself. And that just kind of gets complicated into all that. And so, and it's also worth thinking through and researching the theory behind some of these crimes and some of these ideas of what is or isn't right to do in a society. Sometimes things are crimes for silly reasons. Sometimes for reasons that made an awful lot of sense 200 years ago, but not so much today. Lots of different things can wire into things. And also importantly, you can have things that aren't illegal but maybe should be, right? So there are certainly behaviors that are destructive where the law just hasn't caught up with it yet. We've had a lot of problems with that in recent years with intellectual property law and free use of materials on the internet, and this question of our laws were built for a very different society in terms of protecting somebody's intellectual property at a reasonable level. So figuring that out can be a complicated thing. This is very important in like a cyberpunk world or a near future world where you're going to have an internet, you're going to have people who have been dealing with that for decades and have a much more mature view of what is or isn't right to do online. And it's all worth thinking through and digging into. So again, when it comes to justice, you got to think about what is a crime, what are the severities of crime, what are the punishments for those, how are they reported, and what is your personal view of those crimes, and what do you think is just or reasonable vis-a-vis these crimes, these punishments you come up with. And then I should also point out another very important thing. And let's move these around a little bit. So I think punishments should go up here. How are crimes reported, and then how are crimes adjudicated? How are crimes punished / enforced? Right. So what is your justice system? If someone's accused of a crime, where do they go to? Is there a judge? Is there a jury? All those things. Who's the judge? Who's the jury? how are they put together, and then how is the punishment meted out? Is it done by the community? Is it done by a certain person? That's often what a sheriff or a bailiff would kind of be responsible for, making sure the punishment was actually carried out. And then general enforcement, who checks up and who looks on things. But we'll just say how are crimes punished, because enforcement kind of goes back to how are they reported. So those are all things, again, worth thinking through in your society. And they probably won't be that different from human society, or rather Earth society, what we're used to. But you'll often have some quirks. So let's move to our Bronze Age world of people in our caravans wandering around. And let's add justice. So we have these small communities that are essentially nomadic, moving from place to place. That suggests a lot of internal justice and internal crimes. So crimes against that group are going to be very carefully policed. I kind of like that Japanese idea that crimes are often punished, or that the entire a family is punished for one person's crime. Not necessarily in any ridiculous way. Not like you stole something, kill them all. But the idea that the family has to deal with the consequences of that. They may all get punished for one infraction. So we'll say justice is generally meted out by two. Rephrase this. If a crime occurs within a caravan, the members. So the difficulty here is you can't quite have the tithing concept with everyone within a caravan wagon, because it's generally going to be one family, and families are generally pretty tight. So what we'll say is in each caravan, each will say wagon family is assigned to watch two other wagons for crimes. Thus, if any crime occurs, there are two other families likely to watching for it, let me say. That could be phrased much better, but you get the idea. The crime occurs within the caravan, and is not reported. Caravan. The other two wagon families are charged with reporting it. If they knew it occurred and didn't report it, they are all punished. Minor crimes are punished by fines and public shaming, typically involving all members of the family belonging to the person who committed the crime. So if one person steals a loaf of bread, all the members of that family will be publicly shamed, for example. So a lot of communal engagement with this. Every caravan has a justice who is called when anyone in the caravan is accused of a crime. The justice is similar in stature to the caravan's leader. And always, and this is a society with not a lot of clothing. It's sort of a humid climate, hot humid climate. So you're not going to have big, thick, heavy robes you're going to wear. So got to think of something that is visible. Might be a tattoo, although that wouldn't make sense because, well, maybe it could. And is always marked with a tattoo, question mark? Something along those lines. The justice is elected for life, but can be removed, and always wears a symbol of authority, typically a necklace. As is elected for life, it can be removed by a vote of no confidence and a new justice appointed. Crimes involving two or more caravans, are handled by a committee of justices from all caravans involved, with an extra justice elected temporarily. If to make an odd number. All justice committees must be made up of an odd number of people. So you can break ties. So that would work. Let's see here. What else? Punishments are typically mild. Fines, public humiliation. We'll just say fines and public humiliation. Major crimes are punished by, I think we're going to say like something really serious, like cutting off a finger, by removal of fingers or toes, and even banishment. Yeah, that makes sense. This is where things get interesting, because I mentioned branding and tattooing and such, and here's a good example of where you want to think through your society in the sense that if a criminal gets tattooed, then normal people will not want to have tattoos on them, and you will see probably a social move away from tattoos, and officials probably will not want to be tattooed and will instead have some other way of indicating that they are official. So, and it's not that you couldn't have a leader tattooed with something around their neck, and then criminals tattooed with something in a completely different part of their on their forehead, for example. Very different tattoo, but still it's going to have some social implications, social weirdnesses. And so we're thinking through this idea of whether a punishment is too close to something else that you establish in your society. You don't want, for example, criminals to get a tattoo of something around their forehead, while also saying that people generally tattoo their bodies anywhere they want to. It's like no one's gonna tattoo their forehead if that's how criminals are also tattooed. So again, worth thinking about. Let's see here. How crimes reported, punishments, again, fairly straightforward. No imprisonment, I don't think. That's too difficult for a nomadic people. You might have people who are imprisoned specifically so they cannot be nomadic. That'd be kind of an interesting thing where they are. Ooh, let's do another thing. Serious crimes are also punished by forced labor on the farms. Not all farm hands are criminals, but this is a convenient way, but a large number are. Right, so you have these permanent farms, and they need to be farmed, So it's an easy way of maintaining that, making sure that farm is working is to say, okay, for the next year, you're going to go to this farm and work that farm, and then once you've done that, you're free to go. So, indentured servitude basically as a punishment for a crime, and I like that idea. So you're gonna, and then that also creates some interesting difficulties because the farms now need to have, you'll have kind of free people working at the farms, and then they have to kind of keep an eye on the criminals, and all that kind of good stuff. So the farms might be a little more locked down than you'd otherwise think. Perhaps farm hands are tethered. Criminal farm hands are tethered, so they have a rope tied around their ankle, and that rope is long, but it keeps them in the field or what have you. Or the fields have fences or something. Interesting. Yeah, I like that idea. As a result, farms are usually, we'll say, farms are almost always surrounded by high fences to keep dangerous animals out anyway, and this also keeps the criminals in. Makes sense. All right, moving to our communist ranches. So you have these things, sex, all that kind of stuff, which we didn't cover too much of the sex in the society last time, but we kind of ran out of time. So let's go justice. Again, we want a different take here. So we may have I think we're going to have one of the trades, one of the roles on the ranch is like sheriff. Each ranch has at least one sheriff, has a sheriff, and sometimes also deputies. The sheriff patrols for crimes and serves as police and punisher. Crimes are judged by a random jury made up of members of the farm that are not directly related to anyone involved in the crime. Okay. There's probably also some kind of jury system in the others, but we won't worry about that right now. Okay, that makes sense. Criminal cases are always done outside in the open where anybody can see. I don't know why, but that just kind of makes sense to me. That just feels right for the world, that you want to make this very public, very visible, kind of a big event, if you will. Punishments vary from, let's think about this. Fines, revoking public services, fines to revocation of public services. We'll say minor crimes are punished by fines and or change in social services. A criminal may receive worse food, not be allowed to engage, allowed to work in certain fields fields, both in the physical sense and also in the sense of things they can't do anymore for the group. And otherwise be denied various services by the community. And most ranches have highly convoluted systems or hierarchies of various punishments. Hierarchies. So, stealing a piece of bread means you can't get this, but stealing, stealing a pot of stew means that you don't get that over here. And if somebody else is involved, so there might be this really complicated thing of what happens as a result of certain crimes. I just kind of like the idea. It's sort of baroque and weird, and it varies from ranch to ranch. It's not at all standardized. But it is mostly around, you don't get to benefit from this highly communal ranch. Which again fits the world. If everyone's living in these very tightly knit ranches where there's very little personal space, then not being able to benefit from that tight knit community is a major punishment. Major crimes are punished by banishment or death. And I think because we have this again sort of ranching Wild Westy feel to the society, that's going to be a big. It's going to be people are going to be more willing to do capital punishment in a society like this, especially when a lot of people are moving back and forth from one area to the next. We have gunpowder now. They're starting to become very common, so that again kind of makes sense. Okay. What other punishments do we have? Yeah, I don't think imprisonment's going to be a big deal. It's just kind of inefficient. I don't like the idea of branding or tattooing, although that is a very Wild West thing. Well, let's say banishment. Often with a brand, or death. So you're branded and banished, or just banished for a less serious crime. But if you're branded and you go to another community, you're much less likely to be accepted into that community. So it's a near-death sentence, if you will. Or at least it's saying you're going to have to live on your own, right? You're not going to be able to be part of a group. All right. What else do we have? So, punishment. Are there any unjust crimes? So I'm not going to worry too much about which of these crimes I do or don't agree with. This kind of gets into also the story you want to tell about what kinds of things are considered illicit and what aren't. You can kind of leave that to kind of the obvious things, where stealing and murder and that kind of stuff are crimes. And if there's something you particularly want to explore in your world, then you can introduce those as crimes and kind of work out for yourself what constitutes a crime, what the punishments are for those things. But I think this gives us a good overview for these societies. And we could dig in once we get into more specifics about that. Speaking of, I do know I want to use these settings somewhere. I am thinking of doing like a visual novel set in one of these worlds. Or at least some kind of simple video game. Possibly the setting 2, because it has this wonderful weird magic system. And the other one might make more sense for like a series of books or novels or something. Or short stories set in the world. Maybe even a role-playing game set in that setting. We'll see. It'd be nice to do some art in that or something. Well, who knows? But that might be a good sort of inroad into setting 2. We'll find out. All right, that covers justice. Let me look at my big list of topics that I wanted to cover. We've covered those. We've covered clothing. We've covered gods. We've covered property. We've covered food and tech level. Probably next time we're going to talk about money versus barter. Monetary systems. What do people consider valuable how do they, how do you exchange goods and services in your world? Is it entirely barter? Is there some monetary system? What does that monetary system consist of? And what are some of your options? There's some weird monetary systems out there that we can think of. So that'll do it for us for right now for World Building Wednesday. We'll come back in a little bit at 9 o'clock p.m. Eastern with a Workshop Wednesday with some more painting of D&D miniatures. And thank you all very much for joining me, and we'll be back next time with some more world building. Again, on, I think, money, which is both what makes the world go round and also the love of which is the root of all evil. So that's where it becomes interesting. Thanks all very much, and I will see you in a little while.